All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us at the 2025 AHR Expo. We're spending time in the podcast pavilions talking about transitions, making podcasts that we can share with the industry to help keep everyone informed. There's a lot of things that are moving very quickly, from the regulatory to manufacturing to distribution. And so when we start looking at the process of A2L integration into heat pumps, and particularly residential light commercial sector, well, there's a lot of things to talk about. And we got Chris Forth. How are you, sir?
Great. Thanks for having me.
You know, Chris, we've had a lot of conversations in this last year, some that are just so wild we can't even share with the general audience.
And some are coming true.
And some are coming, like some of the things that we used to say, could you imagine if this would happen? And then all of a sudden, sometimes we'll get together and go, did you see that happened?
And just happening live, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I believe that these types of conversations, these podcasts that can be shared very quickly and can be listened to in that drive between jobs, or listened to while you're in the office working on a project, things that can fill your time with information that doesn't take away from your life, right? You know, we got to have a balance, because if we solely focused on what's happening in our industry, we'd all go mad. So we have to leverage our time.
Yeah, exactly. I think, there's so much going on. I think the big news, right? You and I have been talking about this for years.
Yeah.
January 1st, 2025 is come and gone.
It's gone. It's behind us.
So guess what? I'm not making 410A products. I'm not making some 134A products.
Yeah.
Now, right. So we're in full production on the new A2L products, right?
Okay. And so I've talked to a variety of contractors over the last weeks, over the last few months, looking at the deployment of A2L refrigerants and understanding the differences. And Johnson Controls has done an amazing job of preparing the industry for A2L refrigerants in ducted systems and ductless systems. They've got refrigerant calculators that are so simple.
Yeah.
It's like the easy button for installation.
Right.
And so hopefully everyone's getting more comfortable with the implement of A2Ls and understanding these strategies. Is there anything we need to dive deeper on A2Ls in products?
Well, I think really it's kind of the standard rules apply. Know the basics, right?
Know the basics.
The things you and I have been talking about for many years.
Best
now.
practices.
With A2Ls, of course, the flammability is the new thing, right? But the general service practices, right, that we should have been doing, really everyone should have been doing with the A1s, right, like 410A and 134A, really should, are mandatory now in many cases with the 2Ls.
Yeah, there are some things that used to be best practices in installation manuals that are now actually required by code.
That's right.
But even when you think about what's required by code, purging with nitrogen.
Right.
You would have thought that would have been a requirement by code in the past. It wasn't always a requirement in code.
No, and I think everyone knows fundamentally that's the right thing
That's
to do.
the right thing to do.
And it just helps the system life. You don't have to worry about scaling and plugging up a filter dryer, right? And so those standard practices should, be coming along. And I tell a lot of the contractors that I run into, they always ask about, well, what about the service equipment, the vacuum pumps?
Yeah.
And do I have to replace it? And what I tell my contractors, I say, hey, use this as an opportunity to upgrade.
You bet it is.
Because one of the big trade-offs, I think, that's happened irrespective of the refrigerant transition is the charge accuracy has gotten to be critical.
Yes, it absolutely
a few ounces on some of our high SEER residential equipment make a big difference
Exactly.
in efficiency, performance, how it does in cold climates, right?
That's right.
So you can, just weighing in charge like you kind of used to and kind of approximating it.
Right.
That's the benefit of this, this transition. Use that as an opportunity to come in,
evaluate
get down to the accuracy, and in a lot of cases, one of the things I always preach is, hey, use this as a productivity improvement, because some of these new vacuum pumps are super high volume.
Yeah.
You can pull down a unit literally in half the time you used to in some cases.
Sure.
Right, and we all know, that recovery and reclaim is going to become more.
It's going to be so crucial for our environment.
Even if you may not like the contractors may not like, I got to recover and reclaim, which has always been there.
Yeah.
They're going to need that gas to take care of some of these products that are going to be in the market for a long time.
Service gases, right?
They're going to need it.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, I met with several reclaimers here. If I would encourage your customers, Clifton, if they haven't checked with a reclaimer, and I'm not pointing out any one specific reclaimer, but if they haven't looked at some of the programs they have lately, I know some contractors in the past may have had some bad experiences, like, hey, I don't know the quality of the gas, right? I don't know how much the bottle exchanges. There's many new programs out there that are completely different than they used to be.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's much more favorable towards a contractor than it's ever been, right?
So I had a very interesting discussion with Kate Horton from Hudson Technologies on that process. I'm actually going to be doing a plant visit to do a behind-the-scenes video like we did at Johnson Controls to show reclamation. And she was saying, do you realize that with our new AHRI standards, the refrigerant that we provide back to the industry in many times has a higher purity than that OEM refrigerant that is bulk manufactured because there's no test requirements for
the virgin
refrigerants. You know, it's made to very specific standards, but on the reclamation side, they not only have to have those standards, but they also have to validate it in testing in every sample. So every cylinder that's coming through has been validated to a purity that is amazingly high. So that service gas is as good or purer than the original refrigerant.
Yeah, and again, with the more the higher efficiency equipment and the newer heat exchanger technology, smaller diameter and newer microchannel
designs of coils. The
refrigerant purity has never been more important.
I agree.
Than it's ever been. And I'll say this: in a couple of my other sessions here at the expo this week, I've had a couple contractors come up and go, "Hey, is reclaim really okay? I mean, it's used,
right?"
And what you just said, Zach, very true.
Absolutely.
I said, look, once it's recovered to that AHRI standard, it's chemically identical.
Absolutely.
And many people may not know this, and I don't want to speak for other OEMs, but I can speak for JCI.
Sure.
Many of your customers, if they've gotten some of my equipment because of some regulations in a certain state, probably got some reclaim in there mixed in with their brand new equipment.
And that's going to continue. We've seen regulations that are going to anticipate needing to have some of that as we continue a phase down of all HFCs.
Correct.
It's going to be very advantageous for us to be able to implement that into some of that virgin refrigerant to keep that cost down. I mean, it's going to be crucial.
Well, and again, as the supply, constricts, having that available as a source is going to be very important to get the full useful life of that equipment.
Absolutely. So even when we're talking about our A2L refrigerants, which are still HFC-based refrigerants, right? It's going to be even more important for us to focus on proper installation, proper evacuation, but then in the event of doing repairs and refrigerant replacement, that we're going to be recovering that, getting that back to our reclamation facilities so that we have a supply. Because what a lot of people are still struggling to understand is, yes, we're going through a phase down on virgin refrigerant.
That's right.
But we're not going through a phase down on refrigerant that's been introduced into the industry. So if we can get that back for service gas, we could have an endless supply of service gas as long as we don't let it out. So fixing leaks, making sure that we have proper installations, recovering every ounce that we can. With A1s as well as A2Ls, we could have a very extended service life of our equipment.
That's right. That's right.
So A1s, A2Ls, it's really going to be crucial looking at that. So we've kind of talked about installation and service practices. I'm the same way. I've been advising my contractors to look at their equipment. I do like that, originally UL was recommending that we put a standard for recovery equipment because that's where it's going to be most introduced into the potential for any type of flammability. And I've always been an advocate for having some of the most up-to-date equipment. Just like you were talking about, the efficiency of these new pieces of equipment are so much different. I did a video 4 or 5 years ago where I did a brand new installation, 2-ton system, 15-foot line set, removed the cores, used the proper hoses, and used a 4 CFM vacuum pump, rechargeable, by the way.
A higher volume.
And I did a 500 micron evacuation in 4 minutes. And that's what we can do with modern equipment. The old days, it was, let's go to lunch. And hopefully it will be done when we get back. And so the equipment alone has expedited how efficient we can do these installations.
And I think the other thing we need to remember, Clifton, is that, they do have these new 2Ls, while very close to 410A, have a little bit of difference on the pressure temperature chart.
There are,
So if you're trying to use a 410A gauge, you'll get pretty close with 454B, but 32, and full disclosure, I have products with both 454B and 32 on my ductless. The 410A gauges really won't do you justice on a 32 piece of equipment.
Absolutely.
I mean, you need to have the right gauges.
Accurate gauges.
To get that charge accuracy right.
Yes.
It's super important because I tell you, when I talk to my guys that answer the phones at the factory, a lot of the questions, right, they're like, well, I'm using my old gauge set, I don't have this here, and I'm kind of guessing, and again, a few ounces, a few degrees of superheat can make a difference, especially like on a heat pump or something when it's going into defrost.
Yep.
That's very important to get that right.
I just did I put together a high performance heat pump program for the educators, and in one of the chapters I dive through the actual accuracy comparisons of our traditional mechanical gauges based on what category they were in comparison to our digital gauges, and there's no comparison whatsoever. I mean, I truly believe in teaching fundamentals on traditional mechanical gauges to show the principles, but then moving into digital gauges because of the accuracy.
Right.
And so I'm a very big advocate for using digital gauges. Like even my own Testo smart probes, which are, I think they're about 8 years old now. It's still my little smart probes. The question on one of our live shows was, what about my existing digital gauges that don't have A2L refrigerants? And I pulled out my smart probes and I pulled up my app and I went update firmware and boom, my 8-year-old smart probes now are capable of 454B.
That's right. So, and that's the benefit of the newer
technology.
Equipment. They do have some future adaptation that'll extend their life, quite frankly.
It does.
And at the end of the day, it's really about the quality of the work. It'll help your installation quality, save you time. Again, avoiding that all, dreaded callback.
Yep.
Super important to do that. So can't emphasize the upgrade on equipment. Just like any other industry, having the latest, the equipment. If it saves you time, money, improves the quality of your work, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
This transition is the reason to do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Best time to do it.
Yeah, for those that have got 20-year-old vacuum pumps with PSC motors that spark every single time that you use them that needed replaced 10 years ago, it's time to start looking at DC-operated drives.
Exactly.
They're just so much more efficient and quieter, and I can't say enough for the technology. I've even seen manufacturers that produce entry-line PSC vacuum pumps that are actually A2L compatible because all of the start components have been isolated.
Right. They just took them and isolated towards the back, away from the gas.
Exactly.
I mean, it's not really innovative in that regard. There's been explosion proof, I would call it that. Sure. It's probably not the right term, but just spark proof.
Yeah.
For other industries, now it's coming to us. So.
Yep. So it's just a good time for us to review our arsenal of tools, and good chance it's going to be time for updates.
Yep.
All right, so the fun one, regulatory landscape.
That's where I live.
What's new today?
Yeah, literally, it changes every day. So there's a lot going on. But I think that one of the key aspects is, the A2L is required all the states to update their building codes. Right?
Exactly.
So the industry spent a lot of time. I've personally been working on this. This is my 7th year for this transition that just took effect 1/1/2025. So industry had to do research on 2Ls, and that gets built into the safety standards, right? The UL and ASHRAE. One's a design standard that, as an OEM, I have to design
to comply to. Yeah.
And then there's the application standards, ASHRAE, right?
Right.
That the field uses, and those get pulled into the building codes. It's been a Herculean effort to get all those updated again for this 1/1/2025 date. It's been a massive effort. So the good news is we've got the ability in almost all states, and I would say it is all states, but there's a couple of laggers, and if you're in Nevada, you need to heads up.
Just be aware.
But there's most of that's done. Now, there are states, I will say, Clifton, that because of the timing issue, right? So the EPA drew the line in the sand for residential, like commercial, right? Ductless products.
To technology transition.
1/1/25 was a date, but the state adoption cycles didn't always line up with that.
Oh, okay.
So what we had to do in those states, where the building code cycles lined up with the EPA rules,
right?
That was great. That's the best way to go.
Right.
We would prefer to go the building code route. But in those states that some of them have very long update cycles, and some states don't even have a statewide building code. So it's individual cities and counties and municipalities that have their own adoption cycle. We had to go pass legislation. What's more controversial, and all the legislation we ran around the country doing in those particular states was just to say, hey, if EPA's approved a refrigerant, it's okay to use, right? It's not mandated, but you can use it, right? So that was more about permitting. And then we're coming back around in those states that had the longer adoption cycle and saying, okay, let's belt and suspenders. Let's do the codes now for your state when your cycle comes around. So that's what a lot of us, I have to give a shout out to the Air Conditioning, Heating, Refrigeration Institute,
Yes.
Hardy, the distributor organizations, ACA. We've all kind of pulled on the same chain trying to get these updated, because in states that didn't get that done, right, you couldn't put in the new equipment. And at some point they'd run out of the old equipment.
Yeah, absolutely.
The old higher GWP, and that would be a bad thing. So that's where we're kind of at. Even our friends to the north in Canada, quick shout out to Canada.
Absolutely.
They're still doing the same thing for the provinces, right? And I think we've got all that done. So I think we're good shape for allowing 2Ls. There's still some code work going on there. That's pretty important. But as you and I have talked before, right, the individual states can have their own unique, HFC requirements, and do, as we know, right? New York introduced
their own
further modification to theirs. It's got some pretty big implications for folks. Washington State, California, some of those, and
Colorado,
where they've went out on their own above and beyond EPA.
Exactly.
Now, our selfish need, we would rather states all get in line behind an EPA federal rule, so it's uniform. There's no cross-border, shenanigans and that sort of thing. And so that's pretty much where we're at. The big question, it's like, okay, 1/1/2025 is here for residential light commercial.
Right.
VRF is next
year.
Next year, right? Yeah. There's some chiller products with low temp, I'll call it, industrial cooling that have a little bit further dates, but the big market numbers,
residential
just
light commercial are here.
Happened, a month and a half ago.
Right. And so now we're really in that 10-month sell-through. The 12-month sell-through is 2 months into it, and so it is absolutely a challenge. From the outside looking in, I assumed as a contractor, because I had only worked in Indiana, I hadn't worked outside of Indiana, I assumed that all states had a general code compliance and that the entire country was working at the same level. I did have contractors I talked to in different places that, I knew they had some differences, but I'd never focused on that. So it's really been this last year, following what you're doing, following what Jason, our team, has been doing, and also discussing with you, trying to keep involved, and just realized in this last year or so that we were so divided across the country, and I understandably with A1s, you could do good things and still be in a safe zone.
Right.
And so many states had not looked at their codes in a long time for updates, and so we had different generations of code, all keeping A1s in a safe place. But with A2s, A2Ls, it was very important for us to look on a larger scale. And I completely agree. I would love if we just went, okay, this was set, everyone adopt this, go.
And we would have preferred that too, quite honestly.
Sure, as a manufacturer.
We would much prefer the whole industry kind of aligned behind one. And I understand companies have their different motivations and stuff for doing what they've done, but unfortunately in today's world, companies take different strategies. But I think largely most of the OEMs on the ductless world, on the ducted world, have picked a refrigerant, and then on the ductless products have picked another refrigerant.
I've noticed that quite a bit. Yeah, absolutely.
And really, if you look at the history of that, the ductless products, because the vast majority of those are imported, right?
Yeah, right.
Outside the U.S., where safety standards are different,
it's very different
regulations are very different. That's been in place for a long time.
Right.
The newer refrigerant that most of the OEMs have went to is a newer blend, right? And it's a blend. It's got a lower GWP. It's got some advantage. It's very close to 410A, right? But it's still a 2L,
absolutely,
from a flammability standpoint. So I think as we're, again, we're a month and a half into this transition. I think we'll see some of that settle out, when it comes down to it.
I believe so.
What I can't tell you is, if you ask me, I think anticipating the next question, where are we headed, right? That's a harder one to pick.
I don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
I try to base every one of my intentional statements. I won't say that they're my opinion. They're intentional statements based on current knowledge. And I can honestly say that the things that I was pretty positive of yesterday. I may not be positive on today, and it's an interesting place to be to see how we're in the middle. But that's really kind of any transition.
Yeah.
When we look at any industry that has made some type of a significant transition, and I would just call it it's a significant transition. It's not the end of the world.
Right.
It's just a transition, and there's always small hurdles that we have to get over before we get to the finish line.
Right.
And so I think we'll see this little transition period.
Yep.
And then we'll smooth out, and it'll be back to business as
Well, we certainly would like to, part of my job is to try to provide input to my company so we can have some business certainty, right? Just like
bet.
your contractors, my distributors, that's what we're trying to provide, that information. And no lie, it's right. It's been difficult to predict that.
Yes.
I think the message I would send here is please stay aware of what your local requirements.
Yes.
There's national requirements. You can see the federal level, but your state and even city, like one of our biggest factories is in Kansas, doesn't have a statewide building code.
Okay.
So each city
Regional, yeah.
has can adopt a different version of
Wow.
building code. So just knowing that in one day you may be doing work in one city that has one building code in the same state, and another city may have a different one with different regulations. So the key point is being aware of those, and I would say just having a good relationship with your local inspector, HJ, already having jurisdiction, has never been more important. It's probably always been a good practice.
Right.
Now it's pretty critical to know that.
I've noticed some of the distributors that I've been talking to, because I've been doing some training, and not just A2Ls, but a variety of training in different states and working with different distributors. And they all kind of have this same common theme, that the distributors are starting to work more with their local DOD. So they're actually starting to try to be more aware so that the contractor can come to them and ask questions. So I encourage you to build that relationship between contractor and distributor and your local jurisdiction, because it helps understand, because a lot of these distributors, especially our larger ones, are working through multiple states.
Right.
So they must know those regulations to understand what their product inventory looks like, what products they should have and should not have, what ones they should be going through or sooner or later. And so I've noticed that, and it's very encouraging to see our industry growing. Everyone going, we're all hurting just a little bit, but the more educated we get, the less it stings.
Well, I would just echo that, Clifton, that, as a channel, manufacturers, distributors, contractors, and our customers really need to be in lockstep with each other.
I agree.
And it really is beneficial for us to have always done that, but it's now even more critical, right? I mean, the last thing you want to have happen is go to get a sign-off on a job or an occupancy permit and have your HJ show up and go, what is this?
Yeah.
Right? Now, even though everything may be in place, if that's their first time to see it, that's why the communication, the proactive approach is so critical, because that first time they see it, you don't want it to be a bad experience, so to speak.
Right.
So just like in any kind of, I would say transaction, surprises are not good.
Absolutely.
So
I highly recommend, when you're going to prepare for that first A2L installation and you're going to pull a building code, just ask some questions.
Right.
Ask if they're up to date with codes, and know that A2Ls are now ready and they're actually receiving equipment, because a lot of places those codes have been updated, but they may not have even received the equipment yet. So contractors have been asking us, okay, when is it going to get here? And so when we look across the board, not all manufacturers transitions their line. Pretty much everyone did it in this last year, right? Some were able to prepare to the point, like Johnson Controls, where you could do your production as long as you can to provide enough product for the industry, and then make that transition. Some were in between, but then we also think about like how much inventory a local distributor stocks, right? Some have small warehouses, some have large warehouses.
Right.
So that product transition is happening. So we have A2Ls that are hitting the ground already. We have distributors that are trying to go through their primary R410A stock, and then will only keep enough for like warranty replacements and individual matched components. And so that transition is happening at different stages across the country. I talked to one distributor that just started getting their A2L equipment within the last 2 weeks. I've talked to another distributor that says they will be out of all R410 products within 2 months.
Right.
So that's where the distribution is not exactly consistent across country.
Yeah, as you and I talked earlier, I've done 3 or 4 of these now, and in the audience, when I've asked, I think we had 80 or 100 in one of the audiences. I said, show of hands, how many in the audience have received any A2L equipment? I think it was along the lines of maybe 5% of the audience.
Wow.
So, given where we're a month and a half in, obviously on the residential side, there's some 410A inventory out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? That's going to take a little while to bleed off, but one of the quotes from an old, I'll call it supplier, is we all know summer happens every year.
Yeah.
And that supply will get pulled into the market very quickly, right?
In weeks, it will shrink.
What I'm encouraging the contractors to do, along with our distribution partners, is say, hey, maybe you don't want to do that in the middle of summer for your first time, right? Maybe you ought to try this like now.
Right, get a system in.
Be ready now. And as far as support materials, there's a ton of it out there. ESCO, you guys have a ton. We have a ton. I mean, all the OEMs, the refrigerant producers. So the training materials and videos are all out there, right? I just wouldn't wait till the middle of summer and all of a sudden you deplete your 410A and you're like, oh, I got a crisis job.
That's exactly
emergency replacement. It's got to be up, commercial or residential. And this is the first time I'm hitting it, right? Yeah. So preparation is key.
Yeah, it truly is. And kudos to our distribution networks that are starting to do more trainings, especially product-specific training. It's been fantastic to see how many distributors are now offering training classes.
Right.
Like pretty large classes sometimes with hundreds of people showing up to at least get them introduced to the equipment. So the first time they see that box and they go, what is mitigation? That they already know, and so it's nothing new.
What's that little triangle diamond on there that's red?
I've never seen that sticker before. What is minimum installation area? That's a big sticker on my evaporator coil I've never seen before.
Yeah, so prep's the key, and I think when you came to visit us, recently, we've trained a couple thousand through our training facility. You guys have trained with your material online, I think, quite a bit. Add up all the OEMs. So again, I emphasize the material's there.
It is there.
It's really everywhere, I would say, right? Yeah. To take advantage of that and not doing your first job under a crisis situation would probably be a wise thing.
I agree. Although it would be kind of nice if that installer actually opened up that installation manual and get that piece of equipment and went, I better read this time. That would be kind of... Oh, I'm sorry, installers. We didn't mean that. I've been an installer myself, so I know our industry.
Well, we get it.
We do.
We get it. You're in a job, you're trying to get it done quickly, but again, having the prep done early, right? Knowing that before it gets there, not under the crisis. I did a session yesterday, and one of my key slides is what should contractors do? The first slide was read the instructions. Watch really the instructions, right, in some cases. And I said, you will learn a ton. A lot of your answers are right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And with some of the new tools, electronic tools that we have, that it's easier than ever to pick out that piece of information that's pretty important, right? That they may have a question. What am I charging this pressure to? What's the charge volume, right? And those questions are usually in that manual.
Absolutely.
And that's why we make them, right? So, and I can tell you my guys that answer the calls, right, from our distribution partners or even some of the contractors, in the vast majority of the cases, we'll say on page such and such, this is where you can find it, or you can go to the website on this page, you can find it, right? A lot of it's right there. So just because it's new, right, those standard practices like we talked earlier, the manufacturer's instructions, particularly on when we do a change like this, are super important. Yeah. Particularly when we're going to A2Ls.
Yeah. I reflect back on my own career, and when I was introduced into the industry, I was doing commercial refrigeration and residential installation at the same time. It was a small family business. We did about 30% commercial refrigeration, 70% HVAC between residential, light commercial. And so as I grew up and developed, people always ask, well, how did you become a good installer? I'm like, here's my shelf of installation manuals.
Yep.
And how to become a good service technician. There's the shelf of service manuals. And that really was the heart of how I developed in the industry. Something new came out, I read it. If I had a new control, I read it. And so refrigerant's no different.
The nice thing today is you can watch it.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, you
all
don't
digital.
have to read it. You can watch some of them. A lot of it's online. I know when I go over to my guys that answer the technical call from the field, their offices are surrounded by manuals. Now, a lot of it's electronic online, but even some of their older products, they've got their manuals and paper there that they can go through quickly. And that's just, part of learning any new product, right?
Anything new.
It just happens to be that these are going to a different refrigerant class, flammability class, which has some different requirements on it. So.
And like you mentioned, it's really very similar in pressure to R410A. When we look at like a PT chart, one refrigerant we're going to go above the R410, one we're going to go below the R410. So we need to understand which is doing which. But when we talk about performance, there's always that, well, R12 was such a good performing refrigerant. R22 was such a good performing refrigerant.
Yeah.
When we start looking at R454B and its performance in heat pumps, what do we think we're going to see? Are we going to see like the same performance as R410A, or we're going to be similar?
No, fair question. I get that question all the time, right? And people want to, a lot of comparisons you see, and I would say we've done it as well. When they compare refrigerants, they're just looking at the refrigerant by itself, right? Yes. What's really important is how it's applied, how the equipment, right? So we can design a piece of equipment, regardless of the refrigerant, to be optimal, to meet the energy, whatever energy targets we're looking for, whether it be a minimum or a high efficiency. We can make it work a certain way in, a defrost cycle versus heating, for heat pumps or cooling. So I'd say, from 454B, it was designed intentionally to be as close as possible to 410A.
That makes sense.
So I've got several hundred technicians in our factories in Oklahoma and Kansas where we build the commercial and residential.
Yeah.
And when we first gave them 454B, they're like, hey, this looks very familiar. It looks a little bit different on some of the superheat and subcooling, but it's very familiar. Yeah. In fact, a couple of technicians that have been there a few years, like me, are like, hey, this is way closer than when we went from R22 to 410A. That was a big jump, right? From
Absolutely.
From a pressure temperature step. And they're like, this is pretty close.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, now 32, and again, we use both, has a little bit different characteristics. Yeah. So when we had folks looking at that, they go, now this does look a little bit different. And I go, well, it is.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making there, we as OEMs design the equipment for that specific refrigerant, right? And we'll have supporting pressure temperature charts, charging charts that work for that refrigerant. So I wouldn't get too hung up in the properties of each individual refrigerant, right? I mean, the main reason for our ducted products, we chose 454B. It's got the lowest GWP, right? That's why we're changing.
Yeah, sure.
And from a technician standpoint, it has the most similar performance to 410A.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So similar, ways to... it's very easy to make the transition for 410A from a service perspective, and the whole reason we're changing is the lowest GWP.
Yeah.
So that was our main reason. But our products that we source, they had 32 in that market for years. For them, that made sense to go that route, and they had designed the equipment for 32.
Specifically for that.
So...
because I have noticed like 454B has a lower discharge temperature compressor than like an R32 comparison. So when I look at like performance, not just energy efficiency performance, but like longevity performance, anytime I can reduce that heat transfer off from the head of a compressor, I'm potentially extending life to that.
High temperature shortens life. That's just basic engineering principle. But what I would say is that when you look at one of the big questions that comes up for us is, okay, if I have an old 410A piece of equipment, and say for reasons of not having 410A available for service, what if I put one of these new A2Ls in an old 410A piece of equipment? What do you say to that, Chris? And what I have to tell them is, one, that's illegal to do. You can't do it.
Right.
When I said, here's what I also tell them, right, that if someone tries to use 32, which has been on the market longer, and put it in a 410A 10 piece of equipment, because of that higher discharge temperature, I can tell you it will not run very long.
Exactly.
Because of the discharge temperature, it's going to break down the oil, you're going to lose lubrication, you'll lose a compressor. We've done lots of tests on that. Now,
I can see that.
What I've said is when you design the equipment, right, we have equipment designed for 32, and we, in the design, accommodate that higher discharge temperature. It's fine.
Compressor selection.
But I think a lot of contractors just trying to be, frugal, saying, I want to use this one gas for everything.
Exactly.
Right? And with the regulations, right, it says whatever's on that piece of equipment, refrigerant,
That's
be
what
it
it gets.
the old 410A or the new 454B or 32, that's what has to be used in it. There are no substitutes at this point.
Absolutely. And that's been one of our biggest concerns is, there's always times for maybe accidental refrigerant use in a system.
Yeah.
But it's so important to understand that legally, if I was to do that, I am now 100% responsible because it is a system that was never designed or tested for those applications. And really, when we're looking at any type of refrigeration system, you're right, they're designed so specifically from the refrigerant, not the compressor. The
Right.
refrigerant is the primary factor, and then we build the system based on the performance of that refrigerant. So only that refrigerant is actually going to allow that system to perform the way it was intended.
Right, and from both a efficiency and a reliability.
Exactly.
I think one of the things that when I talk to, I've got lots of contractor friends, and one of the things they think is, the R12 was so great, R22 was so great. One of the things that, let's just say as a scenario, we had not changed refrigerant, but efficiency, the DOE raises that every 6 years or so,
Exactly.
right? Because of the ever-increasing efficiencies, right? Even if we had kept the old refrigerant, just as a scenario, trying to get that performance,
In
right,
new equipment.
is more of a load, right? So
Exactly.
people would say, wow, that refrigerant's not as good as it was be. Part of it is driven by efficiency and performance, and obviously we need to do things to keep things cost effective, right? But that's part of it. It's a combination of not only refrigerant characteristics, but also increasing efficiency at the same time, right?
Right, absolutely.
You and I were talking a couple years ago, just 2 years ago, right, and a month and a half, the whole industry had to upgrade efficiency on the residential side
Everything.
and commercial.
Yeah.
Now, 2 years later, we're having to do
The whole refrigerant change.
the whole refrigerant
and
change.
maintain those efficiencies.
And maintain those efficiencies,
Yeah,
right?
that's a great perspective.
So that's where, the ever-increasing, hurdles. And, of course, that was just for minimum. And, of course, when you raise the minimum, then we reposition the mid-tier
And the
and the higher tier, right,
sure.
that goes up. So those demands on the system and trying to make all of those come together. And, by the way, you have to make them safe, too.
Exactly.
All of that comes together in a product, and that's what we as OEMs do. But I think some of the technicians are unfairly maybe comparing like a 15, 20, 25-year-old R22 piece to a new 454B. It's not just refrigerant change, it's efficiency too.
Very, very significant efficiency differences. Fantastic. Does anyone have any questions on A2L refrigerants as we make a transition from our R410A that we've used for decades into things like R454B? And if you're a contractor and you've not already been exposed to your A2L equipment, it's coming right around the corner.
Well, I'm not making 410A anymore, so it's just a matter
Exactly.
before you do see it if you haven't seen it already.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate everyone joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.